The wind was a blade, honed on the granite peaks of the Cinderhorn Mountains and driven south with a hunter's fury. It scoured the high desert of the New Mexico territory, flaying the meager flesh of the land from its bones. February of 1879 had come in like a starved wolf, and it showed no signs of gorging itself to sleep. Darkness, absolute and ancient, had already swallowed Blue Ash Gulch whole, leaving only the sound of the wind's passage through the skeletal arms of the ponderosa pines. Calder Holt felt the cold deep in his marrow, a familiar ache he had carried since the war. He sat his dun-colored mare, Ash, with the easy stillness of a man more at home in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. They were a single entity against the onslaught, man and horse, their breaths pluming in the frigid air before being torn away by the gale. Calder had been checking his northern fence line, a thankless task in a blizzard. But cattle had a knack for finding the one weak post in a mile of wire and wandering off to their doom. He ran a quiet spread on the edge of Mesa Viridian, a life carved out of solitude and hard labor, and he protected it with a silent, relentless vigilance. He was about to turn Ash back toward the faint promise of his cabin when he heard it. It was a sound so alien to this place, so thin and fragile, that for a moment he thought the wind was playing tricks on him. It was not the cry of a coyote or the scream of a cougar. It was a high, reedy wail, the sound of an infant. It rose and fell, almost lost in the howl of the storm, a flicker of life in a world determined to extinguish it. Calder's hand, resting on the worn pommel of his saddle, tightened. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. His world was one of tangible things, the heft of an axe, the price of feed, the signs of a coming storm, and that sound was real. He nudged Ash forward, letting the mare pick her way through the deepening snow that blanketed the forest floor. The sound came again, a desperate punctuation mark in the wind's long, run-on sentence. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the powder. The ground was a treacherous landscape of hidden rocks and fallen branches. Squinting against the driving snow, he saw the tracks. They were faint, half erased by the wind in the moment since they were made. Hoof prints from at least 2 horses, shod and heavy, not the light-footed, unshod ponies of the local tribes, and alongside them, the scuffed, desperate trail of smaller, booted feet. Someone had been here, recently. He followed the sound, his rifle held loosely in one hand. His senses stretched taut. The cries grew stronger, more defined, leading him through a dense stand of pines to the edge of a small clearing. In the center stood a single fence post, part of an old, forgotten line. It was there, against the dark wood, that he saw the shape. It was a woman, or what was left of one. She was bound to the post with a rusted baling wire, the coils wrapped cruelly around her torso and arms. Her head hung forward, a cascade of dark hair stiff with ice. She wore a simple calico dress, no match for the biting cold, now shredded and frozen to her skin. Her face, when Calder drew closer, was a mask of suffering. Her lips were cracked and blue, split open by the cold. Her eyelids were sealed shut with a delicate, cruel filigree of ice. She was barely breathing, each shallow puff of air a testament to a will that refused to break. At her feet, nestled in the snow, lay 3 small bundles wrapped in what looked like burlap sacks. They were shivering violently, the source of the cries that had pierced the storm. For a long moment, Calder did not move. He took in the scene with a cold, assessing gaze that missed nothing the brutal efficiency of the wire, the deliberate cruelty of leaving her in a thin dress, the placement of the children at her feet like an offering. This was not a random act of violence. This was a message. But Calder Holt was not a man for deciphering messages. He was a man of action. Without a word, without a moment's hesitation, he sheathed his rifle and drew the skinning knife from his belt. The blade was razor sharp. He worked quickly, his gloved fingers surprisingly deft as he sawed through the thick wire. The metal groaned in protest, then snapped. The woman slumped forward, her body a dead weight. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her thin, shivering frame. She was lighter than he expected, almost bird-like. He felt the faint, fluttery beat of her heart against his chest. Her breath hitched, a ragged, painful sound. But she was alive. The will he'd sensed was a hard kernel of defiance deep inside her. He gently lowered her to the ground, propping her against the post she'd been tied to. Then he turned his attention to the bundles. He knelt in the snow and carefully unwrapped the first sack. Inside, swaddled in a thin blanket, was a baby girl, her face pinched and blue with cold, her tiny mouth opened in a silent cry. He moved to the next, and the next, 3 of them, all girls, impossibly small. They were barely making a sound now, their whimpers fading into a low, continuous moan. They were dying. Calder worked with a grim urgency that bordered on fury. He shrugged off his heavy wool-lined coat. The sudden blast of wind against his shirt sleeves a sharp shock. He laid the coat on the snow, wool side up, and carefully placed the 3 infants side by side in the center. May, Laurel, Finch. The names came to him unbidden, simple and sturdy, like the trees that grew on his land. He folded the sides of the coat over them, then unstrapped the thick saddle blanket from Ash's rump. He wrapped the entire bundle in the blanket, creating a warm, insulated cocoon. The moaning subsided, replaced by a faint, rustling sound. He stood and looked back at the woman, Alina Brooks, though he did not know her name yet. She had managed to pry her frozen eyelids open, her eyes a startling shade of blue-gray, fixed on him with a mixture of terror and fierce, questioning hope. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Her body was rigid, her limbs stiff with cold. He carried her to his horse and, with a grunt of effort, settled her in the saddle. He swung up behind her, his body a solid wall against the wind. He pulled the edges of her frozen dress around her legs as best he could and gathered the reins. "Don't you die on my land," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. It wasn't a plea, it was a command, a simple statement of fact from a man who had seen too much death and would not abide it here. Not tonight. As he urged Ash forward, his gaze swept the horizon. Far to the south, down the gulch, a tiny pinprick of orange light, a lantern, or a small campfire winked out, instantly devoured by the oppressive darkness. A faint, acrid smell, almost lost on the wind, reached him. Gunpowder. Someone had been watching. They had waited until he had committed himself to the rescue. Then they had slipped away into the storm. The thought settled in his gut like a cold stone. This was far from over. The journey back to his cabin was a brutal, slow-motion battle. Ash, sure-footed and steady, leaned into the incline, her powerful muscles bunching as she climbed. The snow was deep now, thick and heavy as crushed stone, making every step a monumental effort. Calder kept one arm wrapped securely around the woman's waist, holding her slumped form against his chest. He could feel the frantic, shallow rhythm of her breathing and the faint, thready pulse of her heart, a desperate drumbeat against his own steady rhythm. It seemed to him that her heartbeat was in sync with Ash's plodding hoofbeats, as if the horse's life force were pulling her along, refusing to let her go. The wind was a physical presence, tearing at them, trying to rip her from his grasp. Ice crystals peppered his face, stinging his exposed skin. He lowered his head, shielding her as best he could, his world shrinking to the space between the pommel of the saddle and the woman's cold back. After what felt like an eternity, a dark shape loomed out of the swirling snow. The cabin. It was little more than a one-room box of logs hewn from the surrounding forest. But tonight it was a fortress, a sanctuary. He slid from the saddle, his legs stiff and numb. He carefully lifted the woman down, her body unyielding, and carried her to the door. Balancing her against his shoulder, he fumbled with the latch. The heavy plank door swung inward with a shriek of protesting hinges. revealing a room steeped in profound darkness and cold. He carried her inside and set her down gently in the single straight-backed chair by the hearth. Then he returned for the children. He unstrapped the bundle from the back of the saddle and brought it inside, placing it carefully on the floor near the stove. The heart of the cabin was the cast-iron stove, its embers glowing a dull, menacing red in the gloom. Calder grabbed the poker and stirred them to life. A single red eye blinked open in the dark, then another. He added a handful of kindling, which caught with a hungry hiss, and then laid 3 thick, seasoned pine logs on top. Flames licked up the sides of the wood, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The room began to fill with a welcome, resinous smell and a fragile warmth. Calder moved with an economy of motion born of long practice. He took a large wicker basket he used for firewood and emptied it onto the floor. He lined the bottom with a thick layer of clean, dry hay from a sack in the corner, and on top of that, he laid 2 soft, tanned rabbit pelts. It was a makeshift cradle, but it was warm and dry. One by one, he took the babies from the coat and blanket. He unwrapped them from their damp swaddling and checked them over. They were painfully thin, their skin mottled and cold to the touch, but they were breathing more steadily now in the growing warmth of the room. He wrapped each one in a clean flour sack he used for rags and laid them in the basket, tucking the edges of the rabbit pelts around them. Finally, he turned back to the woman. She was still slumped in the chair, her eyes closed, though he couldn't tell if she was unconscious or simply exhausted beyond measure. He took his heaviest sheepskin cloak from its peg on the wall and draped it over her, tucking it tightly around her shoulders and feet. He threw another log on the fire, and it hissed and popped, spitting sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a starving wolf circling a campfire, searching for a way in. It clawed at the roof and rattled the single glass pane in the window. But inside, the fire roared, the shadows retreated, and the air grew thick with the smell of pine smoke and melting snow. In the quiet space between the wind's gusts, Calder could hear the faint, soft rustle of 3 babies stirring in a hay-filled basket. Life, cornered and nearly extinguished, was beginning to reclaim its territory. The cabin, which had felt like a fortress against the storm, now felt like a field hospital. The air, thick with the smell of wet wool, pine smoke, and the faint, metallic scent of fear, was slowly warming. The fire in the cast-iron stove was no longer a desperate plea, but a steady, roaring assertion of life. Calder Holt moved with the methodical economy of a man accustomed to solitude. His first priority was the basket. The 3 infants, swaddled in the dry flour sacks and buried in hay and rabbit fur, had quieted their cries to weak, mewling sounds. They were no longer blue, but a pale, waxy white. They needed sustenance, and they needed it immediately. He kept a single nanny goat in a lean-to against the cabin, a stubborn creature that survived on juniper bushes and sheer spite. She was his source of fresh milk. He took a small tin pot from a hook, went to the cold corner of the cabin where a covered pail sat, and poured a measure of the thick, creamy milk. He placed the pot on the stove, not directly on the heat, but near the edge, letting the warmth seep into it gradually. While it warmed, he took his knife, the same blade that had cut the wire, and a piece of dry juniper wood he'd set aside for kindling. His hands, thick-knuckled and scarred from a lifetime of rope burns and fence wire, looked impossibly large for the task, but he worked with a sculptor's precision. He shaved the bark, then began to whittle the end, hollowing out a small, shallow bowl. He smoothed the edges with his thumb, again and again, until it was as fine as sanded glass. He wiped it clean on his sleeve and set it down. He dipped a finger into the pot, testing the milk. Too hot. He added a splash of cold water from the bucket by the door. He tested it again, this time pouring a few drops onto the sensitive skin of his inner wrist. It was lukewarm. Satisfied, he dipped the newly carved spoon into the pot. He knelt by the wicker basket. He gently lifted the head of the first baby, the one he'd mentally named May. Her mouth gaped open in a weak, reflexive search. He touched the spoon to her lips. She gagged, unused to the solid object, and the milk dribbled down her chin. He tried again, slower, letting only a single drop bead on her lower lip. Her tongue, impossibly small, flickered out and tasted it, a tiny, almost imperceptible swallow. He proceeded with the patience of a trapper checking a line. A drop for May, a drop for Laurel, a drop for Finch. He rotated among the three, giving them only what they could handle, his large, rough hand cradling the backs of their heads. It was a slow, agonizing process. The wind still battered the walls, but inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the faint, wet sounds of swallowing. It took the better part of an hour, but color began to creep back into their faces, not a healthy pink, but a return from the ghostly white. They quieted, their breathing deepening, and one by one, their eyelids fluttered and closed. Only then did he turn his full attention to the woman. She was still slumped in the chair, wrapped in his sheepskin cloak, her head lolling to the side. She was breathing, a shallow, ragged rhythm that whistled in her chest. He needed to get the frozen, wet rags of her dress off her. But first, he had to deal with the ice and mud caked to her skin. He put a kettle of water on the stove to heat. When it was warm, he poured it into a tin basin, the steam rising in the cold air. He soaked a strip of flour sack in the hot water and gently pressed it to her face. She hissed, a sharp intake of breath as the warmth touched her frozen skin. But she did not wake. He wiped away the grime, revealing the person beneath. She was young, perhaps younger than he'd first thought, with fine, high cheekbones and a strong jaw. And she was bruised, under the mud and ice. A deep, violet stain spread from her cheekbone to her jaw, the unmistakable mark of a closed fist. He moved to her hands, which were clenched into claws in her lap. He had to gently uncurl her fingers, one by one. Her wrists were worse. He soaked the rag again and pressed it to the skin. The rusted baling wire had not just bound, it had bitten. The cold had frozen the metal to her skin, and where he'd cut it away, it left raw, angry lines, bracelets of ruptured flesh that oozed a thin, clear fluid. He worked with a dispassionate focus, cleaning the grit from the shallow wounds. He found an old tin of axle grease mixed with comfrey, a rough salve he used for rope burns, and gently applied a thin layer. He paused, looking at the sleeping woman and the basket of sleeping children. The cabin was a pocket of fragile warmth, a temporary halt to the cruelty of the world outside. He felt a familiar restlessness, the need to do something tangible. He stoked the fire, then sat on his stool. He picked up the remaining scraps of juniper wood. His knife emerged again. He looked at the basket. M, L, F. He carved the first initial, a simple, straight-legged M. He did not know their names. He did not know if they would live to have names. But for now, they were not just the babies. They were M, L, and F. He wasn't naming them. He was just marking their existence, an acknowledgement against the void that had almost claimed them. He placed the 3 small squares of wood on the hearth to dry. The storm broke just before dawn. The relentless shriek of the wind eased, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. The world outside was muffled by a thick blanket of new snow. A pale, gray light, thin as gruel, began to seep through the cabin's single window. It was this light that woke her. She moved with a sudden, violent start, a choked cry dying in her throat. Her eyes flew open, wide with a terror that saw nothing but the ghosts of the night before. "Easy," Calder said, his voice low. He didn't move from his stool by the fire. "You're safe. The fire's on." Her gaze snapped to him, uncomprehending. Then, it swept the room, the log walls, the rifle rack, the stove before landing on the wicker basket. A sound escaped her, a raw note of anguish and hope. She tried to stand, but her legs, frozen and battered, buckled beneath her. She fell back into the chair, her hands clutching the sheepskin cloak. They're warm, Calder said, fed, sleeping. She stared at the basket, tears welling and freezing on her bruised cheeks. She finally looked back at him, her eyes tracing his face, seeing him for the first time. "My name," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp, "is Alina Brooks." She watched him for a long moment, as if measuring his capacity for the truth. "They will come back," she said. It was not a fear. It was a fact. Calder gave a single, short nod. "I figured as much." He stood and walked to the door. He'd already seen it. When he'd gone out to check on his horse and feed the goat, he'd seen the tracks, clear in the new snow. Not just the shod horses from the night before, but the wide, unmistakable ruts of a wagon wheel, and the dark, wet stain of ashes from a doused campfire. Still warm to the touch, just inside the tree line. They hadn't just left her. They had posted her, and they had waited. He returned to the center of the room. He lifted the heavy iron bar and settled it into the brackets on the door, securing it. He took handfuls of dried straw from the basket's supply and began stuffing them into the cracks in the door frame and the window sash, sealing the cabin against the wind and prying eyes. His movements were calm, deliberate. His preparations done, he turned to his rack. He pulled down the Spencer rifle, a heavy, reliable weapon from his time in the cavalry. He broke it open, checked the magazine tube, and satisfied himself that it was fully loaded. He worked the lever, the smooth, metallic shing-shick of the action a sharp, definitive sound in the quiet room. He placed it by the door. Then he checked his sidearm, a Colt revolver, spinning the cylinder, checking each cartridge before sliding it back into the oiled leather of its holster. He turned back to Alina. She had watched his every move, her eyes dark with a terrible understanding. "You've got a story," he said. It wasn't a question. "Best you tell it." She spoke in fits and starts, her voice rough, her words broken by shivers and the painful intake of breath. It was a story as old and as cruel as the land itself. A marriage, not of love, but of ink and paper. A contract arranged by her father to secure water rights from the neighboring ranch. A massive spread run by a man named Barnaby Kells. "The agreement," she whispered, her hands twisting in the sheepskin, "was for continuity, for a line. She had been a commodity, traded for access to a creek during the dry season. Kells, she explained, was a man of immense, quiet ambition, a pillar of the community in public, a man of cold calculation in private. He didn't want a wife, he wanted an heir. An heir would legally solidify his claim, through household rights, to a vast swath of communal grazing land that lay between their properties. And she had failed him. "I gave him daughters." Her voice cracked on the last word. The disdain she'd faced was palpable. When the midwife announced the birth of triplets, all girls, the house had fallen silent. She had become not just a disappointment, but an obstacle. "He needed a way," she said, her gaze drifting to the fire. "He needed the claim, but he didn't need me." The whispers started a month ago. Hired hands talking about her frail condition. Kells, in his polite, concerned voice, mentioning her maternal instability to the preacher. It was a lie. Carefully built, a legal framework to have her declared unfit, a way to seize custody of the children and, with them, the land. "He wouldn't let me leave, but he wouldn't let me stay." She closed her eyes, the memory of the night before rising. The men coming to the nursery, the wagon, being dragged to the fence line at the edge of his property, the very edge of Calder's land. A warning, a public disposal. When she finished, the silence in the cabin was heavy. Calder looked from her bruised face to the 3 small, carved letters on the hearth. M. L. F. He walked over to her. She flinched as he knelt, but he did not try to touch her. He reached out his rough, calloused hand and laid it not on her, but on the thick sheepskin cloak that covered her shoulder. It was a gesture of grounding, a barrier. "Mr. Kells might have his paper," Calder said, his voice a low rumble. "He might have his laws and his rumors." He looked at the basket, where Finch had begun to stir, a tiny fist waving in the air. "But in this cabin, on this mountain, they—" He nodded toward the children. "Are the only thing worth raising." Alina looked at his hand, then at his face. She saw no pity there, only a hard, quiet resolve. For the first time since the ice had sealed her eyes shut, her breathing came a little deeper. Outside, the snow had stopped completely. The world was a blinding, pristine white, but now, visible on the ridge to the south, was a new set of tracks. A single rider, picking his way carefully, observing the cabin from a distance. A patrol. They were checking the fence line, making sure the job was finished. Alina saw the tracks too, through the small, clean patch of the window. The fear returned, but it was different now. Colder, sharper. Calder rose and put another log on the fire. "Sleep," he said. "They'll be back, but not today. Today, you heal." Alina leaned her head back. She was exhausted, broken, but the kernel of defiance he'd sensed in the storm was still there. She drifted into a true, deep sleep. Not of surrender, but of recovery. The cabin was filled with the scent of hot iron and resinous pine. The stove ticked and popped, and the log walls, finally saturated with heat, felt less like a prison and more like a promise. Dawn did not arrive. It seeped. It was a pale, sulphurous yellow that filtered through the single, frosted window pane, staining the air in the cabin. The world outside was a study in white and blue shadows, silent and predatory. Inside, the stove ticked, a steady, metallic heartbeat. The air was warm, layered with a sense of drying wool, boiling goat's milk, and the sharp, clean smell of the juniper Calder had used for the spoons. Alina was awake. She had not truly slept, only drifted in a shallow, bruised state of consciousness. She sat propped against the cabin wall on Calder's cot, the heavy sheepskin cloak still wrapped around her. Her breathing was steadier, the wounds on her wrists a dull, fiery ache instead of a frozen numbness. A shadow passed the window. Calder, who had been standing by the stove, didn't reach for his rifle. He simply looked toward the door. A moment later, a soft, deliberate knock, 3 light taps. A pause. Then 2 more sounded. It was a code. He lifted the heavy bar, and the door opened on its protesting hinges, letting in a swirl of frigid air. The woman who stood there seemed carved from the mountain itself. She was short, broad, and wrapped in so many layers of mismatched wool and rabbit fur that she looked almost spherical. This was Edaloom. She was the high country midwife, a woman who moved through the Cinderhorn range like the winter wind, respected by the Ute, tolerated by the settlers, and bound by no law but her own. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her eyes the color of creek water over stone. She stepped inside without invitation, carrying a heavy burlap sack, and nodded once to Calder. "Heard you had company." "Word travels fast," Calder said, barring the door behind her. "Tracks travel faster," Etta corrected him, her voice like gravel. Her gaze found Alina on the cot, then immediately swept to the wicker basket by the hearth. She moved toward the children, her heavy boots making no sound. She peered in, her weathered face softening for just a fraction of a second. Triplets, and girls. Barnaby Kells must be fit to be tied. Alina stiffened. "You know him." Etta let out a dry chuckle. "Everybody knows Kells. Child. He owns the bank, he owns the water, and he owns the county board. Which brings me to the news from town." She set her sack on the small table. "I was down in Mesa Viridian for supplies. The talk is thick as mud. Kells isn't claiming you ran off. He's claiming he sent you away for your own protection. Got 4 hands from the Double Bar outfit deputized this morning. They ain't bounty hunters. They're an escort." She spat the word like it was poison. "They have papers saying they're to retrieve his wards and bring them back to their rightful place." "Paper?" Alina's voice was thin. "Just paper." "The worst kind." Etta said, "Signed by a circuit judge Kells keeps on his payroll. It's legal-sounding theft." She looked at Calder. "Even Sheriff Dempsey can't stop it." "Nora?" Calder asked, his voice tight. "Aye, Nora Dempsey. She's a good sheriff, maybe the only honest one we've had, but she's one woman against a county board that eats out of Kells's hand. They're pressuring her. They told her this is a domestic matter, and if she interferes, they'll have her badge for obstruction." The cabin felt suddenly colder, the fire doing nothing to warm the new chill that settled in the room. Kells wasn't just coming with force. He was coming with the color of law. Etta turned practical. She began to unpack her sack. She was a woman who dealt in facts, not fears. She placed a small cloth bag of dried willow bark on the table. "For the fever, a tin of dark green salve. Comfrey and pine tar for those wrists. Keep it clean or you'll lose the hands." Then came the other provisions. A leather pouch of dried pinto beans, a heavy block of beeswax, and finally, a small, leather-wrapped object. She unfolded it, revealing a thin, gleaming steel blade, honed to a razor's edge, more delicate than Calder's skinning knife, a surgeon's tool. "The beans will keep your strength," she said to Alina. "The wax'll seal boots or wounds. The blade—" She paused, looking at Calder. "It's for fine work." Etta gathered her empty sack, pulling her furs tighter. She walked to the door, then paused, her hand on the latch. She didn't turn around. "He'll send those riders up the main path. He'll want you seen. Want this done in the open. But if you have to run—" She gestured with her chin toward the back wall of the cabin, where a small, covered opening served as a root cellar hatch. "That'll put you out by the wash. Follow the creek bed down. Stay in the water. It's colder than a banker's heart. But it leaves no trail. That's how I got here without his sentry seeing me." She slipped out as quietly as she had arrived, and the bar fell back into place. The cabin was silent again, but the world had pressed in. The beans, the blade, the beeswax, they were tools of a siege. Alina closed her eyes, and the present faded, replaced by the memory of a different day, one filled with sunlight and the smell of expensive perfume. Her wedding day. She had worn lace, sent all the way from St. Louis. Barnaby Kells had smiled, his hand resting lightly on her arm. He was a handsome man, with clear eyes and a polite, cultured voice. He had not looked at her. Not really. He had looked past her, at her father, who stood by, nervously twisting his hat. The "I do" was not a promise. It was the closing of a deal. Her signature on the marriage certificate, filed in the county seat, was the final clause in a contract that granted her father's parched ranch perpetual access to Kells's artesian well. Her life, traded for water in a time of drought. She remembered their wedding night. He had been polite, distant. There was no passion, only a sense of duty, of an unpleasant but necessary task being completed. He didn't want a wife, he wanted an heir, a son. A son would activate the household clause, legally annexing the grazing lands that lay between their properties. A son was a tool, a key to unlock more land. Alina had learned to live in the silence of that grand, cold ranch house. She made herself small. She smiled when smiled at, spoke when spoken to, and prayed for the son that would secure her position and, perhaps, earn her a sliver of worth in his eyes. Instead, she had given him May, Laurel, and Finch. The shift was immediate. The polite smiles vanished, replaced by a cold, appraising stare. He looked at her as he would a mare that had thrown a lame foal, a failed investment. His visits to her room stopped. The whispers began. The hired men who used to tip their hats, now looked through her. She was a ghost in her own home. She had chosen silence to survive. She would raise her girls quietly, stay out of his way, and pray he would simply forget them. That had been her plan, until the night of the blizzard. She had been in the nursery, rocking Laurel, who was colicky. The wind was rising, scraping branches against the glass. She heard voices from the porch below Kells and two of his foremen. They were drinking, their voices loud and careless on the wind. "It's an embarrassment," Kells said, his voice stripped of its usual politeness, hard and flat as a shovel. "3 of them, useless. And she's unstable. The whole county will know it soon enough." "So what's the plan, boss?" one of the men asked. "A lesson," Kells replied. The air was frigid, but his tone was colder. "A lesson outside the fence. We'll leave her on the Holt property line. Let that lone wolf deal with her. By the time the storm clears, the coyotes or the cold will have solved the problem. The children will be orphans, and I'll be the grieving widower, forced to take custody." A lesson outside the fence. The blood had drained from Alina's face. This wasn't just abandonment. It was a death sentence. She didn't think. She acted. She wrapped the babies in every blanket she could find, her hands shaking so violently she could barely tie the knots. She slipped down the back stairs, through the kitchen, and out into the stable. The storm was already a wall of white. She grabbed the first horse she could, a skittish gelding. She managed to get the children into a pair of empty feed sacks, tying them loosely to the saddle horn. She untied the reins, pulled open the gate, and kicked the horse into the raging dark. She hadn't gotten a mile. The horse, blind in the snow, stumbled. She was thrown, the sacks landing hard beside her. Before she could remount, they were on her. The foreman, they dragged her, kicking and screaming, through the snow. They didn't hit her. Not then. They just laughed. They dragged her to the fence line, the one separating Kells's vast empire from Calder's meager spread, and as the storm hit with its full, blade-like fury, they used the rusted wire. They left her there, a piece of human refuse, and took the horse back, leaving her to die. Alina's eyes snapped open. Back to the present, the smell of pine smoke, the ticking stove. Calder Holt was standing by the window, not looking at her, but out at the snow-covered mesa. He was working a tanned deer hide, his hands moving with practiced strength as he stretched it, preparing it to be tacked to the wall for curing. His gaze drifted from the window to the wicker basket. The children were sleeping, their faces peaceful, oblivious. He watched them for a long time. The isolation he had cultivated for years, the quiet emptiness of his cabin, had been breached. But it was not an invasion. It was an anchoring. He was no longer just a man surviving on a mountain. He was a man with something to protect. He put down the hide. He walked to the hearth and picked up the 3 small, rough squares of juniper wood he had carved the night before, the ones marked M, L, and F. He looked at them, then tossed them into the fire. They sizzled and caught, the initials glowing bright orange before turning to ash. He took a new piece of wood, a smooth, pale piece of aspen, and his knife. He sat on the stool, the wood in one hand, the knife in the other. He began to carve. This time, he was not just marking, he was naming. His hands, so large and rough, moved with an incredible, gentle precision. The blade whispered over the wood. He carved the first one, May. The letters were deep and clear. He started the second, Laurel, and the third, Finch. He was not just carving wood. He was setting a post in the ground. He was drawing a line. Alina had watched him. Her breath caught in her throat. She watched him throw the first set of blocks into the fire, a small gasp escaping her. She watched him carve the new ones. When he was finished, he didn't look at her or present them. He simply placed the 3 new, beautifully carved, named blocks on the hearth, side by side, where they could see them. A single, hot tear traced a path down Alina's bruised cheek. It was not a tear of grief, but of release. She lifted a hand, her fingers trembling, and placed it over her own heart, feeling it beat, strong and steady. For the first time since she had said, "I do." The cold, permanent knot of fear deep in her stomach began to loosen. Her mouth, which had been a grim, tight line of survival, softened at the corners. It was not a smile, but it was the promise of one. Calder stood, his work done. He looked back out the window, his eyes scanning the foothills. The sunlight was bright now, glinting off the vast, untouched snow. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. Far below, at the base of the mountain near the main trail, a thin, gray column of smoke began to rise. It was too small for a warming fire, too deliberate for a traveler. It was a signal. The scout, they were in position. The clock was ticking. They came at midday. The sun was a weak, indifferent disk in a brilliant blue sky, its light doing nothing to warm the air. The world was sharp-edged and silent, every sound carrying for miles. Calder heard them long before he saw them, the rhythmic creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of hooves in deep snow. 4 of them. He was outside, splitting wood, the axe rising and falling in a steady, metronomic beat. He didn't stop. He continued his work, each swing a declaration of normalcy, a refusal to be intimidated. Inside the cabin, he knew Alina had moved to the window, a silent shadow behind the frosted glass. They rode into his small clearing and reined in their horses, forming a loose semicircle around him. They were hard men, the kind who found their work on the fringes of the law. Their leader, a man with a raw, wind-burned face and a long, drooping mustache, sat his horse with a lazy arrogance. This was Crook Danner. They did not draw their weapons. That, Calder knew, was the most dangerous sign of all. It meant they believed they had an authority greater than that of a gun. Danner unbuttoned his heavy coat and pulled a folded piece of paper from an inner pocket. He let it snap open in the cold air. A fancy red wax seal was affixed to the bottom. "Calder Holt," Danner said, his voice loud, meant to carry. "We're here on county business. We have an order of household wardship, signed and sealed by Judge Miller, for the return of the 3 infant children of Barnaby Kells." He began to read from the document, his tone a mocking sing-song of legal jargon. Legally designated wards, maternal instability, immediate and peaceable return to their rightful guardian. Calder finished his swing, the axe biting deep into a round of pine. He sank the blade into the chopping block and straightened. Turning to face them, he wiped a hand on his trousers, his movements unhurried. "That's a handsome piece of paper," Calder said, his voice quiet but carrying the same weight as the blows of his axe. "But it's invalid." Danner's smirk faltered. "Invalid. This is stamped by the Mesa Viridian County Court. Holt, it's the law." "Paper isn't the law," Calder replied, his eyes moving from Danner to each of the other 3 riders. "The truth is the law, and that paper is based on perjured statements. A document obtained by fraud has no standing." One of the other riders shifted in his saddle. "You a lawyer now. Holt." Calder ignored him, his gaze fixed on Danner. "Besides, up here we have our own way of doing things. You know about the resident assessment clause. It wasn't a law written in any book, but it was a custom as old as the mountains, a sort of frontier due process. It held that any legal matter involving a mountain resident first had to be assessed for merit by a gathering of their peers before any outside authority could be enforced. It was a tool of delay, a shield against the often corrupt laws of the towns below. It was a bluff, but a powerful one. Danner's eyes narrowed. He knew the custom. To ignore it would be to alienate every independent rancher and trapper in the Cinderhorns, men whose cooperation was often necessary for survival. "That's old-time nonsense," Danner sneered, though the confidence had gone out of his voice. He folded the paper with a sharp crack. "The judge wants this settled. You will present yourself, the woman, and the children in Mesa Viridian tomorrow by noon. We'll have a formal hearing. She can make her assessment then." His gaze shifted, trying to peer past Calder toward the cabin door. "We just want to see that the property is undamaged." The cabin door opened a few inches. Alina stood there. She was not hiding. She held one of the baby's Laurel wrapped tightly in a blanket, and the wicker basket with the other two was at her feet. Her hair was clean and tied back. Her face was pale, and the bruise on her cheek was a dark, ugly flower. But her chin was up. Her eyes, clear and direct, met Danner's without a flicker of fear. She held his gaze, and in that moment, she was not the unstable, hysterical woman his paper described. She was a mother, a lioness. The sight of her, so defiant and composed, and the clear evidence of the sleeping children, seemed to throw Danner off balance. He had come expecting to collect a madwoman and her squalling issue. He found a family. Calder stepped sideways, blocking the view. He didn't raise his voice. His hands hung loose at his sides, empty and relaxed, but his stance was as immovable as a boulder. His eyes were like chips of granite. "You've delivered your message," he said, his voice dropping to a low, flat tone that was more menacing than any shout. "Now get off my land, bring me a valid writ from a federal marshal, and we'll talk again." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind sighing through the pines and the snort of a nervous horse. Danner looked at Calder, at the set of his jaw, and he saw a line he could not cross. Not today, not without bloodshed, which would complicate the clean, legal theft his employer wanted. He gathered his reins. "Have it your way. Halt!" He turned his horse, the other three following his lead. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Danner paused and looked back over his shoulder. "It's a long, steep trail down to Mesa Viridian," he called out, a pleasant, conversational tone lacing his words with venom. "Lots of ice on the path this time of year. A horse can lose its footing. Accidents happen." Then they were gone, their hoofbeats fading into the vast, cold silence. That night, the cabin was a fortress again, but a different kind. The threat was no longer an abstract storm. It had a face and a name. After Alina and the children were asleep, Alina on his cot, the basket beside her, Calder got to work. He didn't light a lamp. He moved by the flickering light of the fire. He knelt at the hearth and, using the tip of his knife, worked a particular stone loose from the mortar. It came away with a soft scraping sound, revealing a small, dark cavity beneath, reaching inside. He pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. He carried it to the table and, in the dim, dancing light, unwrapped it. Inside was not gold or a weapon, but a small stack of papers, tied with a leather thong. He untied them and spread them out. They were IOUs, promissory notes, written in Barnaby Kells's elegant, looping hand. They were dated 5 years prior, during the great drought that had almost broken the territory. Calder remembered that year. The creeks had dried up, the grass had turned to dust, and cattle were dying on their feet. Kells's grand ranch, for all its size, had been hit as hard as anyone's. His deep artesian well had been the only source of reliable water for 20 miles. Calder, whose own small spring had miraculously kept a trickle, had driven his small herd deep into the high country, finding hidden patches of graze, but other, smaller ranchers had faced ruin. Kells had offered them a deal water for their stock in exchange for their votes in the next county board election, and for those who couldn't offer a vote, he offered water on credit. The papers on the table were those debts, but they were more than that. At the bottom of each, below Kells's signature, was another line. This debt to be considered paid in full upon the honorable request of Calder Holt. And beneath that, the signatures of the men who had been saved from ruin. These were not just notes of credit. They were notes of honor. Calder had brokered the deal, using his reputation as an honest man to vouch for Kells, and in return, he had demanded this clause. It was his insurance, a check against a man he had never fully trusted. He had never called in the debt. He had hoped he never would. But now, Kells was waging a war with paper. Calder looked at the signatures. Ezra Vale, the preacher, Silas Croft, the blacksmith. Men whose words still carried weight. This was his ammunition. He carefully rewrapped the bundle, placed it back in its hiding place, and sealed the stone with a dab of fresh mud. He turned to look at Alina. She was stirring in her sleep, her brow furrowed. She cried out, a small, sharp sound, and her hands clenched. He walked to the cot and stood over her. The firelight played on her face, softening the edges of the bruise. She was fighting a battle even in her sleep. He knew then that a hidden stash of paper wasn't enough. He could build a fortress of logs and law, but she had to be able to defend herself. The next morning, she asked, "I need you to teach me," she said. She was standing by the stove, holding a warm cup of watered-down milk. Her eyes were clear. The shadows of the night's terrors pushed back. "How to use a gun?" He just nodded. They went out in the late afternoon, when the sun was low and the shadows were long and blue. He took her to a small, secluded copse of aspens, where the sound would be muffled by the trees and the deep snow. He didn't give her the heavy Spencer rifle. He gave her the Colt. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace her wrist with her other hand. "It's heavier than you think," he said. "Respect the weight." She held it, her arms trembling slightly. The cold of the steel seeped into her skin. He showed her how to sight down the barrel, how to line up the front blade with the rear notch. Then he spoke about the trigger. "Most people jerk it," he said, his voice low and calm. "That's why they miss. Don't think of it as pulling. Think of it as a slow, steady squeeze, like you're squeezing a secret and you can't let it out too fast. Let the explosion surprise you." He set a pine cone on a stump about 20 paces away. "Breathe in," he instructed. "Let half of it out. Hold it, squeeze." She raised the gun. Her knuckles were white. She took a breath. The silence stretched. The explosion, when it came, was deafening. The gun bucked in her hand, the recoil jarring her arm to the shoulder. Snow flew from a branch a good 5 feet to the left of the stump. Her eyes were wide, her ears ringing. "Again," he said, his voice unchanged. She recocked the heavy hammer, her thumb shaking. She breathed. She aimed. She squeezed. The second shot was closer, kicking up a spray of bark from the stump. "You're breathing," he said. "You're holding it all in. Let half of it out. Find the stillness in between the beats of your heart." They stayed there for an hour. She fired again and again, the pile of spent brass casings growing at her feet. The sharp, clean smell of gunpowder filled the air. With each shot, the tremble in her arms lessened. Her focus narrowed. The world shrank to the front sight, the target, and the slow, deliberate pressure of her finger. Finally, a shot rang out, and the pine cone disintegrated in a puff of woody shrapnel. She lowered the gun, her arm aching. She looked at the empty space on the stump, then at him. The fear was gone from her eyes. In its place was a hard, cold calm. When they returned to the cabin, the sun had set, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. The air was getting colder. Inside, the fire was burning low. Before he stoked it, Calder did something else. He opened an old sea chest he kept at the foot of his cot and took out an old, tarnished brass lantern. It was a beautiful thing, with intricate scrollwork and thick, clear glass. He took a length of wire and fastened it to the handle. Standing on his stool, he reached up and hung the lantern from a thick central beam in the ceiling. Right in the middle of the small room, he filled it with oil, trimmed the wick, and lit it. A soft, warm, amber light filled the cabin, pushing back the shadows, bathing the rough log walls in a gentle, steady glow. It was a light that felt different from the flickering, functional fire. It felt like a heartbeat, a center, a point of stillness in a hostile world. He stepped down from the stool. Alina was standing by the table. watching him. The lantern light caught the stray strands of her hair, turning them to gold. She had been holding herself so tightly, a bundle of sharp edges and guarded silence. But now, something in her posture softened. She looked from the lantern to his face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire he was now stoking. He just nodded, his back to her. "No," she said, her voice a little stronger. "I mean thank you for believing me, before you even asked." He turned then and looked at her. In the warm, golden light of the lantern, he saw her, really saw her, not as a victim he had rescued, but as the woman who had stood in the doorway, holding her child, and stared down the barrel of the law without flinching. He gave a single, slow nod. It was all the answer she needed. The day bled away into a bruised twilight, and with the darkness came the rain. It was not a violent storm like the one that had delivered Alina to his doorstep, but a slow, persistent drizzle that whispered against the roof and traced silver tracks down the window pane. It was a sound that sealed the cabin off from the rest of the world, turning the small room into an island in a sea of gray. The fire in the stove was banked low, a bed of glowing orange coals that threw off a steady, gentle heat. The only real light came from the brass lantern hanging from the central beam. It filled the space with a warm, amber glow, a liquid light that softened the hard edges of the room and pooled on the floor like honey. It painted the rough-hewn log walls in shades of gold and deep, velvety brown. It was the light of a sanctuary. The children were asleep in their wicker basket, their breathing a soft, collective sigh that was the quietest, most powerful sound in the room. Alina had fed them, her movements now practiced and sure. She had tended to them with a fierce, focused love that was a thing of beauty and terror to behold. Calder watched her, not with the gaze of a rescuer, but with a kind of quiet awe. He was sitting at the small table, his back to the fire, cleaning the Colt revolver. The rain and the shooting lesson had left a fine sheen of moisture on the blued steel. He worked with a familiar, methodical rhythm, pushing an oiled rag through the barrel, wiping down the cylinder, the scent of gun oil sharp and clean in the warm air. As he was reassembling the action, his shoulder gave a sharp, protesting twinge. During the lesson, in demonstrating how to absorb the Colt's heavy recoil, he'd twisted, and an old injury from a fall had woken from its slumber. He winced, a sharp intake of breath, and tried to subtly roll the shoulder to ease the knot of muscle. Alina saw it. She had been sitting on the stool by the hearth, mending a tear in one of the flour sack swaddles. But her eyes missed nothing. She put her sewing aside and stood. "You're hurt." It was a statement, not a question. "It's nothing," he said, his voice a little too gruff. "An old complaint." He tried to continue his work, but another sharp pain made him stop. She went to the small shelf where Edaloom had left her remedies and returned with a tin of dark green salve. She also brought a strip of clean linen. "Take your shirt off," she said, her tone practical, with the no-nonsense authority of a woman who had just nursed 3 infants. A dark flush crept up Calder's neck. He was a man who lived his life armored in solitude and layers of wool and denim. The request felt more intimate than 1,000 shared words. "It's not necessary." "Don't be a fool, Calder," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Pride is a poor poultice." He hesitated for another moment, then relented with a sigh. He unbuttoned the heavy flannel shirt, his movements stiff. He pulled it off, exposing a torso and shoulders corded with the hard, lean muscle of a man who worked from sunup to sundown. His skin was weathered and tan, cross-hatched with the pale, silvery lines of old scars. He sat with his back to her, presenting the injured shoulder. He felt a profound vulnerability, a sense of being exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Alina opened the tin. The scent of comfrey and pine tar filled the air, a clean, medicinal smell. She scooped a small amount onto her fingers. He expected her touch to be hesitant, perhaps even clinical. It was not. Her fingers, though slender, were strong and sure. They were also impossibly warm against his skin. She began to work the salve into the knotted muscle, her touch firm but gentle. Her thumbs moved in slow, deliberate circles, finding the heart of the ache and pressing, easing the tension. Calder, who hadn't felt the intentional, gentle touch of another human being in more years than he could count, found himself holding his breath. He could feel the warmth of her spreading not just through his shoulder, but through his entire body. As she worked, she had to lean closer. Her hair, which had come loose from its tie, brushed against his neck. He could feel the whisper-soft heat of her breath on his skin. The air between them grew thick, charged with unspoken things. The scents in the room: gun oil, pine tar, the faint, sweet smell of cornbread from their simple supper, and the clean, rain-washed scent of Alina herself seemed to braid together into a single, intoxicating aroma. His entire body was a taut wire of awareness. He was conscious of the slight rasp of the linen of her dress against his back, the quiet rhythm of her breathing, the way the lantern light cast the shadow of her hand on the wall. He closed his eyes. Her work finished, her hands stilled, but she did not move away. She remained where she was, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. He could feel the slight tremor in them. Or was that his own body trembling? "Better," she whispered, her voice very close to his ear. He couldn't find his voice. He just nodded, a short, jerky motion. He felt her lean her forehead against his uninjured shoulder, a gesture of profound weariness and trust. He sat, rigid and unmoving, a statue of a man, afraid that if he breathed, he would shatter the fragile perfection of the moment. After a long silence, she lifted her head. He felt the loss of her warmth immediately. He turned his head to look at her. Her face was very close to his. The amber light of the lantern softened the hard lines of grief and fear, illuminating the dusting of freckles across her nose and the startling, clear gray of her eyes. They were no longer filled with terror or desperation. They were filled with a quiet, steady resolve. They were looking at him, into him, with an honesty that stripped away all his defenses. "I do not owe you this," she said, her voice low but perfectly clear, each word deliberately chosen. "This isn't gratitude. This isn't a debt for my life or for my children." She took a small, steadying breath. "I want this with you." The words hung in the warm, silent air. Calder felt them land not in his ears, but deep in his chest, where they extinguished a long, smoldering loneliness he had forgotten was even there. He looked into her eyes and saw his own solitude reflected, and he saw her choice, freely made, shining back at him. He moved slowly, with a reverence that bordered on fear. He was a man of rough hands and rough ways, and he was terrified of breaking this beautiful, fragile thing she was offering. He reached out, not to pull her to him, but to gently cup her face in his hands. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones, just below the fading bruise. He stood and gently drew her to her feet. He guided her a single step forward, directly into the pool of golden light beneath the hanging lantern. The light enveloped her, tracing the line of her throat, catching in the damp strands of her hair, making her seem to float in the warm amber glow. It was a deliberate act, a conscious movement out of the shadows and into a place of clarity and warmth. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss of profound gentleness. It was a question, a hesitation, a soft pressure that asked for permission. It held all the respect he felt for her, all the admiration for the strength she had shown. It tasted of rain and wood smoke and a quiet, desperate hope. For a moment, she was perfectly still. Then, he felt her answer. It was not a sound, but a subtle shift in her entire body. She leaned into him, a surrender that was not one of weakness, but of trust. Her forehead came to rest against his. Her hand, which had been at her side, rose and found his, her fingers lacing through his. They stood like that for a long time, their foreheads pressed together, their hands entwined, breathing the same air. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic patter of the rain on the roof, a gentle percussion that seemed to mark the slowing of their own heartbeats. His shirt was still off, and he could feel the warmth of her through the thin calico of her dress. It was a chaste embrace, their clothes a proper and respected barrier, but it was more intimate than any he had ever known. Every point of contact was a conversation. Her body, which had been a tight knot of tension since he'd found her, finally began to uncoil. He felt the muscles in her back relax, the rigid line of her shoulders soften. He, in turn, felt a deep, profound peace settle over him, the easing of a guard he had kept for a decade. He took a deep breath, the first truly deep breath he'd taken in days, and felt his chest expand against hers. He lifted his head and kissed her again. This time, there was no question. It was a kiss of acceptance, of shared understanding, and in the middle of it, a small, slow smile spread across her lips, a smile he felt more than saw. It was then that a new sound entered the room, a small, questioning coo from the wicker basket. May was stirring. The sound broke the spell, but gently. It was a reminder of their reality, of the three small, precious lives that were the center of this new world. Alina pulled back slightly. Though their hands remained clasped, the smile he had felt was now visible on her face, a genuine, beautiful thing that made her eyes shine in the lantern light. She kept her forehead pressed against his. "Later," she whispered, the promise a warm breath against his lips. "When it's safe." He nodded, his throat too tight for words. The promise was not just for a moment of intimacy. It was a promise for a future they would have to fight for, a future where safe was a place they could build together. He bent and picked up a thick wool blanket from the end of his cot. He draped it around her shoulders, pulling it close. She leaned against him, her head finding the curve of his neck. He held her, his arms around the blanket, their hands still intertwined between them. The lantern above them swayed ever so slightly in a draft from the chimney, its warm, golden light pulsing, a slow and steady beat in the heart of the quiet cabin. It was a gentle, hopeful, and cautious rhythm, a heart just beginning to trust itself to beat again. Outside, the rain fell, steady and clean. It dripped from the eaves and ran in small rivers across the packed earth of the yard, washing away the tracks of the men who had come, washing away the blood and the fear, slowly, patiently, erasing the scars of the past from the wounded land. The fragile peace of the lantern-lit night was shattered by a pre-dawn visitor. It was not Danner's men. It was a single rider, muffled and quick, who used Etta's creek-bed approach. Calder had the rifle in his hands before the coded knock 3. 2 sounded on the door. He opened it to find Sheriff Nora Dempsey. She was a tall, spare woman in her 40s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the cinder horns. She wore no badge, just a heavy wool coat and a grim expression. "You can't stay here, Calder," she said, her voice low, wasting no time on pleasantries. She stepped inside, her sharp eyes taking in Alina, the children, and the barricaded door. "The news from town is bad. Kells isn't sending Danner back. He's coming himself." Alina, who was nursing Laurel by the fire, went rigid. "He's bringing Pratt Greeley, his lawyer," Nora continued, chafing her gloved hands by the stove. "They're not coming to escort you. They're coming to enforce." Greeley convinced the judge to issue a writ of seizure. They're planning to impound the children, citing Kell's paper and your unsafe environment. They'll be here by sunrise. "I won't let them," Calder said, his voice flat. The Spencer rifle felt heavy in his hands. "If you fight them here, you'll be dead by sunup," Nora countered, her voice sharp as ice. "They'll call it resisting a legal order, and Kells will have everything he wants, the children, the land, and your head on a spike. You can't win by force." "Then what?" Alina asked, her voice trembling but defiant. "You don't fight. You appear." Nora's plan was audacious. "The writ calls for a hearing at noon. Kells and Greeley are coming up here to make sure you're not at that hearing. They want to corner you, to make this a fight on the mountain. You're going to deny them that. You're going to walk right into that courthouse. But you are not." She fixed Calder with a stare. "Going to walk in alone." The hours before dawn were a blur of tactical, feverish activity. This was Calder's territory, and he would use it as a weapon. First, he built the ghosts. He took his old oilskin greatcoat, stiff with the grime of a dozen winters, and stuffed it with hay from the goat's lean-to. He propped this straw-filled sentinel on a pair of crossed fence posts, jammed a battered hat on its head, and set it in the deep shadows near the woodpile, a silent, unmoving guard. Next, he took his spare lantern, the one with the cracked glass, lit the wick to a low, smoky gutter, and placed it behind a massive, fallen log on the main trail, a quarter-mile from the cabin. In the pre-dawn gloom, it would look like a small, poorly hidden campfire. Finally, he went to the fork in the trail. He gathered a pile of damp, resinous pine boughs and lit them. They wouldn't produce flames, only a thick, acrid column of smoke that would hang heavy in the cold air. His trap set. He returned to the cabin. While he worked, Alina had become a model of grim efficiency. She had sacrificed her own spare shawl, tearing it into strips to create a harness. She bound May and Finch to her body, one against her chest, one on her back, their small forms disappearing under her cloak. She would carry Laurel in her arms, freeing Calder's hands for his rifle. "It's time," Nora said, peering through a crack in the window. The first faint hint of gray was polluting the darkness to the east. They didn't use the door. Calder silently unbolted the small, low hatch to his root cellar at the back of the cabin. One by one, they slipped out into the frigid air, the ground hard as iron beneath their feet. Nora led, then Alina, a living, breathing vessel of her 3 children, and finally Calder, who moved backward, covering their exit, his rifle at the ready. He guided them to the creek Etta had shown him. The water was a black, icy ribbon, and stepping into it was a shock that stole their breath. The cold was a physical pain, a set of iron teeth biting at their ankles and calves. But it was, as Etta had promised, a road that left no tracks. They moved in silence, the only sound the faint, liquid whisper of their passage and the sharp crack of ice breaking under Nora's boots. They were a mile down the gulch when they heard it. A shout, then another, and the sudden, unmistakable thunder of a dozen hooves. Danner and his men. The scene played out in Calder's mind as if he were watching it himself. Danner's posse would have seen the smoke at the fork. They would have split, one group charging the cabin, the other following the false sign. The group at the cabin would have found the straw man, riddling it with lead before discovering the ruse. They would have seen the guttering lamp behind the log, panicked, confused. Then, they would have found the tracks Calder had laid just before he left his spare horse, a rangy bay, dragging a heavy bough behind it, tearing a desperate, messy trail down the wrong canyon, the one that led to the sheer cliffs of Smoky Draw. "They're runnin'," croaked Danner's voice, full of triumph, echoed faintly down the mountain. "They're trying for the South Pass after them." The entire posse, Kell's legal escort, thundered off in the wrong direction, chasing a ghost horse down a dead-end canyon. Alina let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a year. Calder allowed himself a grim, thin smile. He paused, looked back at their pursuers' fading sounds, and then followed Nora and Alina out of the numbing water. He did not let them rest. He unslung a bundle of juniper boughs he'd stashed by the creek bank and, walking backward, meticulously brushed away every print, every speck of mud, every broken twig that marked their exit from the water. He erased their presence from the earth. When they reached the wagon road at the base of the mountain, the sun was just beginning to touch the highest peaks. A small buckboard wagon stood waiting in the shadows, a mule already harnessed. Etta Loom was there, a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. Beside her stood a man in a preacher's black frock coat. He was tall, gaunt, and his eyes burned with a cold, righteous fire. This was Reverend Ezra Vale. "We were beginning to worry. Sheriff," Etta said, her voice dry. "The diversion worked," Nora replied, climbing stiffly from the wash. "Are you ready, Ezra?" "I have been ready for 5 years." "Nora," the preacher said, his voice a low baritone, "to see a debt of honor paid." Alina, shivering, shifted the babies, who had miraculously slept through the ordeal. Etta came forward and looked them over, her leathery hands checking their warmth. "I have my ledger," Etta said, patting a heavy, oilskin-wrapped book in the wagon. "It shows I delivered 3 healthy children to a sane and healthy mother. It is a legal record." A moment later, another rider appeared, coming from the direction of town, a broad-shouldered man covered in soot. Silas Croft, the blacksmith. He nodded to Calder. "You called. I came." He said simply, "I'll be damned if I let Barnaby Kells forget who kept his herd alive." The plan was set. They were no longer fugitives, hunted on a mountain. They were an assembly. The law, represented by Nora. The church, by Ezra Vale. The community, by Silas Croft. And the truth, by Etta Loom. They didn't sneak into Mesa Viridian. They timed their arrival for 10:30, when the weekly farmers' market was at its peak. The main street was a river of people, horses and wagons. Their procession cut right through the center of it. First came Sheriff Nora Dempsey, badge now polished and pinned to her chest. Then, the buckboard, with Etta Loom at the reins and Alina beside her, her head held high, her children a visible, tangible, and very much alive refutation of Kells's rumors. Beside the wagon rode Reverend Vale, his black coat a stark symbol of moral authority. Flanking them were Calder and Silas Croft, 2 silent, resolute ranchers who missed nothing. The crowd went silent. Farmers paused with sacks of grain halfway to their wagons. Wives stopped haggling over bolts of cloth. They parted like the Red Sea, their murmurs following the procession like a wake. This was not the arrest of a madwoman. This looked like an escort of honor. On the wide pine plank steps of the courthouse, Barnaby Kells was waiting. He was the picture of civic authority, dressed in a tailored black frock coat, a silver brocade vest, and polished boots. Beside him, his lawyer, Pratt Greeley, nervously shuffled a stack of papers. Kells was smiling, a broad, confident smile for the public, the look of a man concerned but in control. But Calder, with his hunter's eyes, saw the details. He saw the dark, red rims of Kells's eyes, sleepless and furious. He saw the fresh mud caked on the heels of his expensive boots, proof of a frantic, failed morning spent on the wrong mountain. He saw the tightening of Kells's jaw as he looked past Alina and saw her witnesses. Kells had expected to drag a hysterical woman and her abandoned children into town, a picture of tragic necessity. He had not expected her to arrive at the head of a parade, flanked by the town's conscience and its sheriff. The cold smile on Kells's face froze. His eyes met Calder's, and for a second, the mask slipped, revealing the raw, cold fury beneath. Then, high above them, the heavy bronze bell in the courthouse tower began to strike the hour. Dong! The sound cut through the murmur of the crowd. Dong! The market fell silent. Dong! It was noon. The semi-public household wardship hearing was about to begin. The room was not a hall of justice. It was a tinderbox. It was the county's main assembly room, smelling of floor polish, old tobacco, and the damp wool of the 50 souls packed into the pews. Sunlight cut into stark on dusty bars by the tall, narrow windows fell upon the crowd. They were miners, ranchers, farmers, and shopkeepers, all drawn from the market by the promise of a showdown. At the front, on a raised dais, sat Judge Miller, a man whose judicial robes couldn't hide the fact that he was body and soul, one of Barnaby Kells's investments. Kells sat at a heavy oak table to the right, the picture of aggrieved dignity. His lawyer, Pratt Greeley, a small, bird-like man with a reedy voice, stood and shuffled his papers. On the left sat Alina. She refused to be cowed. She held May in her arms, while Laurel and Finch slept in the wicker basket at her feet. Calder Holt sat beside her, his hands resting on his knees. He looked as out of place as a granite boulder in a drawing room. Beside him sat Sheriff Nora Dempsey, Etta Loom, Reverend Ezra Vale, and Silas Croft. They were not a legal team. They were a wall. Pratt Greeley began to speak, his voice filling the charged silence. "Your Honor, we are here today on a matter of profound sadness and urgent necessity." He gestured to Kells, who dutifully lowered his head in a mask of sorrow. "My client, Mr. Barnaby Kells, a pillar of this community, seeks only the safety of his wards. His wife, Mrs. Alina Brooks, has been suffering from a severe instability of the mind since the birth of her children." A low murmur rippled through the pews. "In a fit of maternal hysteria," Greeley continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "She fled her home, taking the infants into a dangerous blizzard. She has been concealed by Mr. Holt, who, in his own misguided way, has prevented their lawful guardian from securing their safety." He held up the writ. "We are here to see this document enforced and to return these poor children to their father's care before any more harm can befall them." Judge Miller nodded gravely, as if the matter were already settled. "Sheriff Dempsey, given that you are involved, do you have anything to say before I grant Mr. Kell's motion?" Nora Dempsey stood. She did not address the judge. She turned slightly, addressing the room. "I do not have a legal argument, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I have facts. I would like to call Miss Etta Loom." Etta stood, her mismatched furs making her look like a force of nature. She held up her thick, leather-bound ledger. "I am the registered midwife for this county," Etta said, her voice like gravel. "I delivered these children." She opened the book. "On November 12th, 1878, I attended Alina Brooks. She delivered 3 girls. She was lucid, calm, and in perfect health of mind and body. The births were without complication. I have the records here, signed by me, witnessed by her house staff." She slapped the book shut. The only instability in that house was Mr. Kells's temper when he saw they were not boys. "Objection," Greeley squeaked. "This is hearsay and slander." "It is a fact entered into the county record. Mr. Greeley," Nora shot back, "and Miss Loom is a sworn officer of that record." Before the judge could rule, Nora pressed on. "I now call Reverend Ezra Vale." The preacher stood, his gaunt frame seeming to fill the room. He, too, addressed the crowd. "5 years ago," he began, his voice a low rumble, "we faced a drought that nearly ended us. Barnaby Kells had water. We had dust. Mr. Kells offered a deal brokered by Calder Holt, water for our herds, in exchange for community support. But he signed a pledge, Your Honor." He held up a copy of the old agreement. "He signed it with a wax seal, promising to protect and maintain the integrity of his household in good faith. That integrity was the foundation of our deal." Ezra's eyes found Kells. "A household, Mr. Kells, is a place of sanctuary. You do not maintain its integrity by casting its members into a storm." "This is preposterous," Greeley shouted, seeing the narrative slipping. "A water contract has no bearing on a domestic custody matter." "It has bearing on a man's honor," Silas Croft roared from his seat, causing the judge to hammer his gavel. "Mr. Holt," the judge said, glaring, "do you have anything to add to this disruption?" Calder stood. The room went silent. He was not a man of words. and they all knew it. "Your Honor," Calder said, his voice quiet, yet it carried to the back wall. "I'm not a lawyer. I don't know about contracts or households." He turned his head and looked at Kells. "I'm a rancher, and I know what I found. I found Alina Brooks tied to my fence line with baling wire. I found her 3 children wrapped in burlap, freezing to death in the snow at her feet." A collective, sharp gasp sucked the air from the room. The image he painted was brutal, stark, and utterly devoid of legal jargon. It was an image they all understood. Baling wire. A blizzard. These were not the actions of a concerned husband. She was left to die. Calder finished. "I did not conceal her. I cut her down." He sat. The silence that followed was heavy and accusing. The townsfolk were no longer curious spectators. They were a jury. Pratt Greeley saw the tide turn, and he panicked. He fell back on the one thing he had the unfeeling, brutal letter of the law. "This is sentimental nonsense," he cried, his voice pitching high. "Tragic. Yes, but it does not change the law, Your Honor. I demand you recognize the patriarchal right of stewardship. A wife is chattel. Her children are chattel. They belong to the husband, as surely as his horse or his house. His reasons, his methods are his own business. He is here to claim his property." The word property hung in the air, cold and ugly. Judge Miller nodded, relieved to be back on solid legal ground. "Mr. Greeley is correct. The law is unfortunate, but it is clear." "The law is not finished," Nora Dempsey said, her voice cutting like a razor. She stepped forward. "Mr. Greeley is fond of old statutes, but he seems to have forgotten the Mesa County Ordinance on maternal protection, passed by this very board in 1871 after the winter of the lung fever." She looked at the crowd. "We all remember it. We lost 9 children that winter, and we passed an ordinance stating that in any time of declared acute crisis, be it sickness, famine, or severe weather, the physical safety and preservation of a mother and her infant children supersedes all other claims, including those of debt or property." She turned back to the judge, her eyes like steel. "A blizzard is a severe weather crisis. This hearing is a property claim. The ordinance applies. Her safety, and the safety of those children, comes first." As Greeley began to stammer that the ordinance was only for public health matters, Etta Loom moved past him. She held up her hand. "This is not a claim, Your Honor," she said. She was holding a small, stiff piece of dark blue calico, the very fabric of Alina's dress. It was stained black with dried blood. "This," Etta said, her voice dropping, "is the piece of cloth I had to peel from Alina Brooks's wrist. The wire had cut through it and into her skin. The blood froze the fabric to the wound. This is not a household matter. This is evidence of a brutal, cowardly assault." She flung the scrap onto the judge's bench. It landed with a tiny, damning thud. The room was stone silent. Every eye was on Barnaby Kells. Kells, who had cultivated an image of untouchable, civilized power, finally broke. He had been outmaneuvered by a mountain sheriff, humiliated by a vagrant midwife, and cornered by a preacher's memory. The mask of the grieving patriarch cracked, crumbled, and fell away, revealing the tyrant beneath. "Enough!" he roared, slamming both fists on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "This is an outrage, a conspiracy." Pratt Greeley put a hand on his arm. "Barnaby! No!" Kells threw the lawyer's hand off. "This is all a distraction. I am the one wronged here. I had a contract to fulfill. I needed a legal heir to secure the Cinderhorn grazing rights. I needed a son." His face was purple, his eyes bulging. He had lost control. He jabbed a finger, not at Alina, but at the wicker basket by her feet. "And she failed me. She gave me nothing," he spat. "She gave me nothing but more mouths to feed daughters. What good are daughters? They're just mouths. They are worthless for the contract, worthless." The word worthless detonated in the room. For a second, there was silence. Then, a woman in the back row, a rancher's wife, stood up. "Shame," she cried. Then another, "Monster!" The room exploded. Men were on their feet, their faces dark with fury. These were men who loved their daughters, who relied on their wives. The women in the crowd were a solid wall of righteous rage. Kells hadn't just insulted Alina. He had insulted every woman and every father in the room. "Order, order!" Judge Miller hammered his gavel, his face ashen. He had lost his courtroom. He had lost his town. Sheriff Nora Dempsey strode into the chaos, her hand held high. Silence, her authority, born of respect and not fear, slowly settled the room. She turned, not to the crowd, but to the cowering judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice hard and official, "this hearing is clearly no longer about a household wardship. In light of Mr. Kells' public statements, which provide a clear and chilling motive, and in light of the physical evidence of aggravated assault presented by Miss Loom, I am formally requesting a full criminal investigation into the actions of Barnaby Kells and any men who acted on his orders." Judge Miller, trapped, looked at Kells, then at the sea of furious faces. He nodded, his power gone. This hearing is suspended indefinitely," he stammered. Pending a criminal inquiry, temporary custody of the children is granted to the mother, Mrs. Alina Brooks, for her and their protection." Kells looked stunned, as if he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Greeley was frantically, uselessly gathering his papers. Calder did not smile. He did not look at Kells. He turned and looked at Alina. She was trembling, her knuckles white as she clutched May. He met her gaze. His eyes were steady, and in them, she read the truth. This was not a victory. It was a ceasefire. It was the first battle in a war that was far from over. "We have a long way to go." Alina held his gaze. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first true breath of freedom she had taken in a year. She nodded. Nora Dempsey touched her arm. "This way. Alina, Etta and I will take you out the back. Let's go home." They stood as a group, enclosing Alina and the children, and moved toward the judge's chambers, leaving Barnaby Kells alone at his table, a king who had just lost his kingdom, surrounded by the accusing, disgusted eyes of the people he had once owned. The victory in the courthouse was a fragile thing, a piece of paper against a mountain of hate. They knew it. As their small procession left Mesa Viridian under the cold, watchful eyes of the late afternoon, the mood was not one of triumph, but of grim resolve. Kells had been publicly humiliated, and a man like that did not forgive. He retaliated. They traveled not the main trail, but a winding secondary wagon path that followed the contours of Raven Wash, a deep rocky canyon carved by millennia of spring floods. The sun had already dipped below the western peaks, plunging the canyon into a premature twilight. The air grew cold, carrying the scent of damp stone and pine. Nora and Silas rode point, their rifles unholstered. Etta drove the buckboard, with Ezra Vale beside her, his face a stoic mask. Calder rode alongside the wagon, his hand never far from his Colt, his eyes constantly scanning the rock-strewn slopes above. Alina sat in the back of the wagon, the wicker basket with May and Finch beside her, Laurel asleep in her arms. The Colt Calder had given her was tucked into the waistband of her dress, its cold, hard weight a constant reminder of the world they now inhabited. She was not the same woman who had been tied to a fence post. That woman had been a victim. This woman was a survivor. They reached the old wooden bridge at the narrowest point of the canyon just as the last of the light bled from the sky, leaving only a sliver of a moon to silver the landscape. The bridge was a skeletal structure, its timbers groaning under the weight of the wagon. Below, the waters of Raven Wash, though low, slid over black, polished stones with a sinister whisper. It was a perfect choke point, a perfect place for an ambush. Calder reined in Ash, his head cocked. The normal night sounds of the canyon, the crickets, the call of a distant owl were absent. There was only the creak of the bridge timbers and the murmur of the water. A dead, Waiting silence. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice a low growl. Nora, on the far side of the bridge, had already dismounted, her Spencer rifle in her hands. "I don't like this. Calder—" His eyes, accustomed to the dark, scanned the bridge structure. He saw it then, a detail that would be invisible to most. On the thick central support cable on the far side, a heavy hemp rope meant to stabilize the span was a dark, wet-looking patch. It looked as if it had been soaked in oil, to soften it for a saw. He followed the line of the rope to where it was anchored to the canyon wall, and saw the faint, pale scar of freshly cut rock, and the glint of moonlight on something metal. A winch, or a lever. They weren't just waiting. They had set a trap. "Get back!" Calder yelled, his voice cracking like a whip. "The bridge is rigged!" But it was too late. A coarse laugh echoed from the rocks above. "Smart man, halt! Too smart for your own good." Crook Danner. The night exploded. A muzzle flashed from the rocks, a second from the trees on their side of the canyon. They were caught in a crossfire. Silas Croft grunted, grabbing his arm where a bullet had torn through his coat. The mule pulling the buckboard screamed, rearing in its harness. Calder didn't hesitate. He grabbed the lit lantern hanging from the side of the wagon, its flame throwing wild, dancing shadows. With a powerful, underhand throw, he hurled it high into the air toward the rocks where Danner's voice had come from. The lantern arced through the darkness. A small, fiery comet. It smashed against the granite cliff face, a good 30 feet up, and the oil ignited with a whoosh. For a single, brilliant second, the entire canyon was illuminated in a flash of orange light, and in that light, Calder saw them. 4 men, including Danner, crouched behind the rocks, 2 more in the trees on their side, 6 of them. The light died, plunging them back into a deeper darkness, their eyes still seared with the afterimage. But it was enough. "Nora!" Calder yelled. "Covering fire at her! The shallows!" The plan was instant, unspoken. Nora, a seasoned fighter, didn't need to be told twice. She dropped to one knee, using her horse for cover, and began to lay down a steady, methodical fire at the places where she'd seen the muzzle flashes. The heavy boom of her Spencer echoed off the canyon walls. Etta, her face a mask of grim determination, sawed at the reins, wrestling the terrified mule. "Hiya, hiya!" she screamed, her voice cracking. She steered the buckboard off the path, toward a shallow, gravelly ford a few yards downstream from the bridge. The wagon wheels screamed as they left the path, jolting over rocks. Alina grabbed the sides of the wicker basket, shielding the infants with her own body. Laurel woke with a start and began to cry. Then May joined in, her wail thin and terrified. The sound cut through the chaos of the gunfire, a sound of pure, helpless innocence in a world of violence. Alina felt a surge of ice-cold calm. She held Laurel tighter. She began to sing. It was a simple lullaby, a tune her own mother had sung to her. Her voice, though trembling, was clear and steady. The song was a shield, a point of sanity in the madness. She sang to her children. She sang to herself. She sang to keep her breathing steady as she reached for the cold, hard steel of the Colt. A rider burst from the trees near them, a big, bearded man, his face twisted in a snarl. He spurred his horse toward the wagon, a long knife in his hand. Calder was there first. He spurred Ash and his horse, a trained cattle pony, slammed her shoulder into the other horse's flank. The animal went down with a scream, throwing its rider. But now they were exposed. From the far side, Crook Danner, seeing his trap foiled, leapt onto his own horse. He wasn't armed with a gun, but with a long, weighted lariat. He spurred his horse into the shallow water, cutting off the wagon's escape. "The woman's mine! Halt!" he roared, swinging the lariat. Alina saw him coming. She saw the cruel arc of the rope. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. As Danner's horse drew alongside the lurching wagon, she stood, with both hands, She raised the heavy Colt revolver and brought the steel butt of the gun down with all her might on Danner's outstretched wrist. There was a sickening crunch of bone. Danner screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and agony, and the lariat flew from his nerveless fingers. His knife, which he'd drawn with his other hand, clattered to the rocky ground. The action gave Calder the opening he needed. He drove Ash forward, closing the distance in 2 powerful strides. He didn't draw his gun. This was too close, too personal. He launched himself from the saddle. He hit Danner with the full force of his body, a brutal, shoulder-first tackle that knocked the bigger man clean out of his saddle. They landed in the shallow, icy water with a tremendous splash, then rolled onto the wet, sandy bank. They came up grappling, 2 beasts in the moonlight. Danner was bigger, heavier, but Calder was wiry and fueled by a cold, desperate rage. Danner's hand scrabbled in the dark, finding the knife he had dropped. The blade glinted. He slashed wildly. Calder twisted, and the blade opened a long, shallow gash on his cheek. The sudden, hot sting followed by the coppery taste of his own blood. Danner pressed his advantage, straddling Calder, forcing the knife down toward his throat. Calder caught his wrist, their arms trembling with the strain. Danner's face, inches from his, was a mask of hate. "Kells pays well. Holt," he grunted, forcing the blade lower. Calder's free hand, scrabbling for purchase, plunged into the cold, wet mud of the creek bank. An idea, born of desperation, flashed in his mind. He scooped up a handful of the thick, gritty slurry and slammed it into Danner's face, grinding it into his eyes. Danner roared in pain and surprise, momentarily blinded. His grip loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all Calder needed. He twisted his body, using his legs for leverage, and rolled, reversing their positions. Now he was on top. Just then, the world seemed to hold its breath. A low, guttural rumble echoed down the canyon. It was not gunfire. It was thunder. The air, which had been still, suddenly stirred with a cold, damp wind. The sliver of moon disappeared behind a bank of fast-moving clouds. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, and with the rain came the flood. It was not a gradual rise. It was a wall of water, a flash flood, born of a sudden cloudburst high in the mountains, roaring down the narrow channel of the canyon. The whisper of the creek became a deafening roar. The water, brown and churning with debris, hit them. Danner, still trying to clear the mud from his eyes, lost his footing on the slick rocks. He was swept away, tumbling end over end in the powerful current. Nora, seeing him go, ran along the bank, expertly throwing a loop of her lariat. It caught him, and she dug in her heels, dragging his half-drowned, sputtering form to the bank, where she unceremoniously hauled him up and slapped a pair of iron cuffs on his broken wrist. The other ambushers, seeing their leader captured and the wrath of the heavens descending upon them, melted back into the night. The floodwaters surged, licking at the wheels of the buckboard. Etta, with a final, desperate heave, got the wagon onto the relative safety of the higher bank. Ezra Vale, who had been silently loading Silas Croft's rifle, bowed his head. "The Lord is a righteous judge," he murmured, his voice almost lost in the roar of the water. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the wind died. The roar of the water subsided to a manageable gurgle. The clouds parted, and the moon shone down on the aftermath. Their flight continued in a grim, wet silence. They abandoned the buckboard, Calder and Silas loading what they could onto the horses. They were all soaked, chilled to the bone. They finally found shelter an hour later, in a place known as Viridian Candle Station, a long-abandoned stone way station, its roof mostly intact. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dust and pack rats. Etta, ever practical, produced a handful of tallow candles from her bag. Soon, a handful of small, flickering lights pushed back the oppressive darkness, casting their small party in a warm, yellow glow. They huddled together, sharing a loaf of hard, dry bread from Ezra's saddlebags. Alina was shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline of the fight finally giving way to shock. Calder took off his own heavy, damp cloak and draped it over her shoulders. He hesitated. Then his hand came to rest on her shoulder. A brief, solid pressure. A gesture of support that asked for nothing in return. He was respecting her space, giving her the room to process the violence she had both witnessed and committed. She looked up at him, her eyes huge in the candlelight. The gash on his cheek was still bleeding sluggishly. She reached out a trembling hand and gently touched the skin next to the wound. "I thought," she began, her voice a raw whisper. "When I heard them cry, I thought I had lost all my courage. I thought it was all gone." She looked from Calder to the sleeping faces of her children in the basket, their faces serene in the flickering light. "But it wasn't gone," she whispered, a look of fierce, wondrous discovery on her face. "It was only sleeping." Summer did not climb the cinder horns. It bloomed. It arrived not as a season, but as a slow, warm tide, washing over the high meadows in waves of Indian paintbrush and blue columbine. The aspens, skeletal and gray through the long winter, grew a shimmering skin of green-gold leaves that trembled in the breeze. The air, once sharp and thin enough to cut, grew soft and thick with the scent of warm pine needles, damp earth, and the distant promise of rain. The scars of the winter began to fade, both on the land and in its people, on the small plot of earth that Calder Holt called his own. A new sound replaced the howl of the wind, the rhythmic, hopeful percussion of a hammer striking nails, the rasp of a handsaw through fresh-cut pine. Together, he and Alina built. They extended the roof of the cabin, creating a deep, shaded porch that faced the vast, open expanse of the valley. They built a long, sturdy table from split logs and 2 benches to go with it. They cleared a patch of ground for a vegetable garden. And Alina, with hands that were learning the feel of soil instead of fear, planted rows of beans, squash, and corn. And they opened Holt's Hearth. It was not a formal business. It was an idea, born from the steady stream of travelers who used the mountain pass now that the snows had melted. Prospectors, trappers, circuit preachers, families in rickety wagons heading west. They were all weary, hungry, and wary of the trail ahead. Calder and Alina offered them a place to stop, a cup of strong, boiled coffee, a bowl of thick bean stew, a safe place to rest their horses and their souls for an hour, in exchange for a few coins, or a story, or a bag of flour. They offered what they had built for themselves, a sanctuary. The children, too, bloomed in the summer sun. They were no longer the pale, fragile bundles he had pulled from the snow. They were alive, vibrant, and growing with the fierce, relentless energy of weeds. Laurel, the quiet observer, had learned to pull herself up on the leg of the new porch table, her small face a study in fierce concentration. Finch, the songbird, did not speak words, but hummed constantly, a low, happy tune that provided a musical backdrop to the rhythm of their days. And May, the bold one, had spoken her first word. She had been sitting on a blanket on the porch, watching Calder split wood. A spark from the nearby cooking fire had caught a piece of dry grass, which flared up in a brief, brilliant tongue of orange. May's eyes went wide. She pointed a chubby finger. "Fa," she said, her voice clear and distinct. "Fa." Fire. The thing that had saved them. The thing that was the heart of their home. The days settled into a new kind of rhythm. A rhythm of work, of growth, of quiet, shared purpose. The threat of Barnaby Kells had not vanished. Nora Dempsey sent word that he was mired in legal challenges in the territorial capital. His power diminished, but his hatred undimmed, but it had receded. It was a distant storm cloud on a far horizon, and they chose to live in the sunlight they had. One afternoon, after the last of the day's travelers had moved on, Calder sat on the porch steps. The air was warm, and the valley below was bathed in the soft, golden light of late afternoon. He was not chopping wood or mending tack. He was sewing. In his large, calloused hands, he held a piece of soft, rust-colored copper wool, a length of fabric he had traded from a passing merchant, with a thick needle and a length of dark thread. He was painstakingly hemming the edges. His stitches were not small or neat, but they were strong and even. He was making a shawl. Alina watched him from the doorway, her heart aching with a feeling so profound she could not put a name to it. She had seen him use those hands to chop wood, to fire a gun, to butcher a deer, to gently feed her children. Now she watched them perform this act of quiet, domestic creation, and she felt the last of the ice around her own heart finally melt away. He finished the hem and knotted the thread, but he was not done. He threaded the needle again, this time with a pale, silvery thread, the color of aspen bark. He turned the corner of the shawl over and began to embroider. 3 small, simple letters, side by side, M, L, F. When he was finished, he folded it carefully and stood. He walked over to where she stood in the doorway and held it out to her. He didn't say a word. His eyes, in the soft light, were full of a quiet, hesitant hope. She took the shawl. It was warm from the sun and his hands. She unfolded it, and her fingers traced the rough, honest stitches of the letters. May, Laurel, Finch. He had not just made a gift for her. He had made a gift that embraced her whole world. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. She lifted the shawl and pressed it to her cheek, the soft wool a comfort against her skin. She looked at him, at this quiet, solitary man who had faced down the law, the wilderness, and the violence of other men. All for them. You chose us, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed a tear from her cheek. There was never another choice, he said, his voice a low rumble. That night, the summer rain returned. It was a gentle, whispering rain that drummed softly on the new porch roof and smelled of dust and growing things. The children were asleep. Their cradle moved inside, their soft breaths the only sound besides the rain and the low crackle of the fire. The brass lantern, now a permanent fixture, hung from its beam, casting its familiar warm amber glow over the room. Calder was at the table, sharpening his skinning knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic shh of steel on stone, a soothing sound. Alina had been mending a tear in one of May's blankets. She put the blanket down. She stood and walked over to him, her bare feet silent on the smooth-worn wooden floor. He looked up as she approached, his hands stilling on the knife. She came to stand behind him. She did not speak. She simply leaned down and wrapped her arms around his back, her hands spreading flat against the solid warmth of his chest. She rested her cheek against his hair, which was still damp from the rain. He sat perfectly still, his body rigid with surprise and a kind of reverent awe. Then, she leaned forward and gently, deliberately, placed her lips on the corner of his mouth. It was not a demanding kiss. It was a kiss of arrival. It was a kiss that said, "I am here. I am home." He turned on the bench, and she moved with him, sinking down beside him. He took the knife and the stone from the table and set them carefully on the floor, out of the way. When he turned back to her, his face was full of a question he did not know how to ask. She answered it by taking his face in her hands and kissing him again. They leaned against each other on the long, hard bench, wrapped in the golden light of the lantern and the soft sound of the rain. They exchanged long, slow kisses that were explorations of a new and wondrous landscape. There was no hurry. There was no desperation. There was only the profound, soul-deep relief of two people who had found a safe harbor in each other. His hand found hers, their fingers lacing together, a familiar, comforting anchor. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, his beard rough against her skin. She rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed. He felt the tremors running through her, the last vestiges of the terror she had endured. He pulled back slightly, his eyes full of a fierce, protective tenderness. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. She opened her eyes. The fear was gone. They were clear and calm and full of a light that seemed to rival the lanterns. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. She nodded. "I'm okay," she whispered back. Then she did something that shattered the last of his defenses. She took his hand, the one that was intertwined with hers, and guided it to her chest. She pressed his palm flat against her sternum, directly over her heart. "I'm okay," she repeated, her voice stronger. He held his breath. Beneath his rough, calloused palm, he could feel it. The steady, calm, rhythmic beat of her heart. It was not the frantic, fluttery pulse of the woman he had cut down from the fence post. It was the strong, even life-affirming beat of a woman who was safe, a woman who was whole, a woman who was home. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple, profound intimacy of the moment. He leaned in and rested his forehead against hers again, and they simply stayed like that, two halves of a whole, breathing in unison. Her other hand came up to rest on his shoulder, and the new, rust-colored shawl he had made for her slipped, unheeded, from her shoulders, pooling in a soft, warm circle at her feet. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The rain had passed, and the sun rose into a sky of impossible clarity. They stood on the porch, the air cool and fresh, and exchanged their vows. There was no preacher, no book, no audience save the mountains. He had no ring to give her. Instead, he gave her a string of beads he had carved during the long nights of the winter, each bead whittled from a different wood pine, aspen, juniper, and polished smooth with beeswax. It was a rosary of the forest, a testament to his patience and his land. She had no ring for him. Instead, she took a single, long strand of her own dark hair and braided it, deftly and quickly, into a thin, strong cord. She tied it around his wrist, a simple, unbreakable circle. Their witnesses arrived a short time later. Etta Loom, on her way to a berth in the valley, stopped, her wise eyes taking in the scene. She simply nodded, a slow smile spreading across her wrinkled face. "About time," she grunted. She was followed by Nora Dempsey, who had ridden up from town. She dismounted and stood before them, her hand resting not on her gun, but on the small, leather-bound book of territorial laws she always carried. "There are laws of man, and there are laws of the heart," Nora said, her voice surprisingly soft. "It looks to me like you've satisfied both." She smiled, a rare and beautiful thing. "Home is where the hearth is tended. You've tended it well." Later that day, Calder took down the old, faded board that had marked the turnoff to his property. In its place, he hung a new one. He had carved it himself from a wide plank of cedar. The letters were not perfect, but they were deep and true. The sign read, "Holt's Hearth. A warm place for the weary. A safe place for the heart." The summer gave way to an autumn of crystalline days and nights sharp with the promise of cold. The aspens on the high slopes turned a fiery, defiant gold, and the air at Holt's Hearth was thick with the scent of wood smoke and Alina's baking. It had become a true way station, a place where the news of the territory was exchanged over coffee and stew. Travelers spoke of Barnaby Kells in hushed, angry tones. His power, once absolute, had been fractured. The criminal investigation Nora had launched was moving at a snail's pace, mired in the corrupt politics of the territorial capital, but his reputation was in tatters. For the first time in a generation, the small ranchers of Mesa Viridian were not afraid. The peace was a fragile, hard-won thing, and Calder knew it would not last. Kells was a predator, and a wounded predator is the most dangerous kind. He came on the last warm day of October, when the sky was a deep, cloudless blue. He did not come with riders or guns. He came as he had begun, with the full, arrogant force of the law. He rode into the yard in a polished buggy, accompanied not by Pratt Greeley, but by a stern-faced, gray-haired man in an expensive suit, a lawyer from Santa Fe. They were followed by a federal marshal. This time, the paper the lawyer presented was not a county writ. It was an injunction from the territorial Supreme Court. Kells had spent a fortune, called in every favor, and used his influence to go over the heads of Nora Dempsey and the local courts. The document was an appeal, a complaint that a local conspiracy had illegally deprived him of his property and custodial rights. It demanded that Alina and the children be brought to the Capitol for a new, impartial hearing. It was a declaration of war by Wallet. "You cannot win this, Holt," Kells said, his voice smooth and cold as a river stone. He had recovered his composure, his public mask of civility firmly back in place. "I will spend every dollar I have to see my rights restored. I will bankrupt you in court fees. I will see you in jail for kidnapping. In the end, they will come home." Alina stood on the porch, holding Laurel's hand. The rust-colored shawl Calder had made for her wrapped around her shoulders. She did not look at Kells. She looked at Calder. Her eyes were not filled with fear, but with a quiet, unwavering trust. Before Calder could answer, another rider appeared on the trail from town. Sheriff Nora Dempsey. She was not alone. Behind her rode Ezra Vale, Silas Croft, and 3 other ranchers from the valley, the very men whose honor Calder had secured years ago. Nora dismounted, her face grim. "A little far from home, aren't you, Barnaby?" The Santa Fe lawyer stepped forward. "Sheriff, this is a federal matter. Your authority ends here." "My authority ends where the law ends." Nora shot back. "And the law is about to get a lot more complicated for your client." She pulled a thick sheaf of papers from her saddlebag. "You see, after our last hearing, I did some digging. I found some old friends of Mr. Kells." She handed a set of sworn affidavits to the marshal. "This is a statement from Silas Croft, and one from Isaiah Flynn, and one from Jedediah Stone, all testifying that during the drought of '74 Mr. Kells did not offer them water. He coerced them. He withheld water from their dying herds in exchange for their signatures on proxy votes that gave him control of the county board." Kells' face paled slightly. "That's a lie. It was a business arrangement." "It was extortion," Nora said, her voice like iron. "And it gets worse." She produced Calder's hidden bundle of IOUs. "We also have these promissory notes, debts of honor, and it seems that when a few of these men tried to repay their debts, Mr. Kells's foreman suggested that their continued access to water depended on them forgetting that the debts had ever been paid. That, counselor," she said to the lawyer, "is fraud, witness tampering, and racketeering." The lawyer from Santa Fe began to look ill. He had been hired to argue a custody case, not defend a man against a mountain of federal charges. "This is an entirely separate matter," the lawyer stammered. "It has no bearing on my client's paternal rights." Pratt Greeley, who had been hiding behind Kells' buggy, finally saw his opening. He had been professionally ruined by Kells' last outburst and saw a chance to salvage something. "Barnaby," he whispered, stepping forward, his face slick with sweat. "Perhaps we should discuss a settlement, a quiet arrangement, a trust for the children. Perhaps we can make all of this go away." It was the final insult, to be betrayed by his own paid sycophant, to be told to settle for what was his. The thin veneer of Barnaby Kells's civilization shattered for the last time, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He whirled on Greeley, his hand raised as if to strike him. "Settle!" he bellowed, his voice echoing across the yard, a sound of pure, primal fury that made the horses shy. "I will not settle. I will not pay for what is mine. I should have handled this myself from the start. I told Danner what to do, tie her to the fence post. I said, leave her for the wolves. Let the code solve the problem. I gave the order. Me." He stood there, panting, his arm still raised, his confession hanging in the stunned silence. He had done it. In his own uncontrollable rage, he had just signed his own death warrant. The federal marshal, who had been a silent, impartial observer, slowly, deliberately, drew his revolver. "Barnaby Kells," he said, his voice calm and final. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and attempted murder." The judge in the territorial court, facing a mountain of sworn affidavits and a public confession, did not hesitate. He signed the order. The criminal investigation was now a full prosecution. Full and sole custody of May, Laurel, and Finch was permanently granted to their mother, Alina Brooks. And as a final, crushing blow, the disputed Cinderhorn grazing lands, the entire prize for which Kells had sacrificed his humanity, were declared protected territorial property, to be held in trust for the public good. The day the news reached Mesa Viridian, the town celebrated. Men stood on the steps of the courthouse and cheered, throwing their hats in the air. Alina stood in the crowd, her 3 daughters clutched to her, their faces buried in her skirts. Nora Dempsey stood beside her, a hand on her shoulder, and simply nodded. "Justice," Ezra Vale murmured, his eyes on the sky. "The righteous seed will find good soil, Sheriff, but it always needs a keeper of the flame." Barnaby Kells was never seen in the territory again. Crook Danner, in exchange for his full and detailed testimony against his former employer, received a lesser sentence for his part in the crimes. The message was clear, and it echoed from the mountains to the plains in this new, hard land. A human life was not a commodity to be traded for a patch of dirt. Back on the slopes of the Cinderhorn, Holt's hearth thrived. The tide of travelers grew. They came for the coffee, but they stayed for the feeling of the place. They were teamsters and merchants, prospectors and preachers. But a new kind of visitor began to arrive. Young mothers, their faces etched with the fear and loneliness of the frontier, would often make the climb. They would sit on the porch with Alina, sharing a cup of herbed tea, and they would talk. They spoke of hard births and harder husbands, of sick children and the crushing weight of solitude, and Alina would listen. She offered them not advice, but warmth, not pity, but understanding, and sometimes a place to stay for a night or two, a brief respite from a world that was often too much to bear. One evening in late autumn, the day's work was done. The air was crisp and carried the scent of coming snow. The lantern cast its familiar golden glow, and the wind in the pines sounded like a lullaby. The girls, now sturdy toddlers, were chasing each other around the porch posts, their laughter a sound that filled all the empty spaces in the world. Alina was leaning against the porch railing, watching them. Calder came to stand beside her, his solid presence a familiar comfort. He slipped an arm around her waist, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching their daughters, watching the last of the light paint the valley in shades of purple and rose. She turned her head, her lips close to his ear. "I want this," she whispered, the words she had spoken on that rainy night so long ago. But this time, it was not a question. It was not a hesitant, fragile request. It was a statement of fact, a confirmation, a vow. "With you." He turned, and the rough-hewn man of the mountains, the solitary rancher who had been a stranger to tenderness, smiled. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet as if she weighed nothing. He swung her around in a slow, gentle circle, her laughter mixing with the sound of the children. He set her down gently, directly in the warm, golden pool of light cast by the hanging lantern. He did not kiss her immediately. He simply looked at her, his eyes full of a love so deep and profound it needed no words. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. Her hands came up to rest on his wrists. Her shoulders relaxed, her body soft and yielding in his embrace. This was not the desperate, hopeful kiss of a beginning. This was the deep, sure, quiet kiss of a lifetime, a kiss of arrival, a kiss that said, "Finally." we are home. The camera of the mind pulls back. It pans away from the man and the woman, bathed in the golden light. It drifts past the three small girls, now huddled together. Their laughter subsided to sleepy murmurs. It takes in the rough-hewn log cabin, the hand-carved sign swinging gently in the evening breeze. Holt's Hearth. It rises higher, showing the cabin as a single, warm point of light against the vast, dark, and indifferent majesty of the Cinderhorn Mountains, now cloaked in the deep purple of twilight, and from that small, brave point of light, the faint, sweet sound of a lullaby drifts up into the night, a fragile but unbreakable thread of warmth and love, weaving itself into the fabric of the wild. Lonely land. In a land where justice was scarce and warmth a commodity, they learned you could still build a home out of trust, keep a fire with courage, and choose each other every single day. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to connect with all of you. So please leave a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from. For more tales like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. And if this story moved you, please consider hitting the hype button to help it reach more listeners.